And our final speaker to talk on Vietnam tonight is Dr. Nguyen Khac Giang. He is a visiting fellow at the Vietnam Studies Program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore that I mentioned earlier. He's previously led the political research unit at the Vietnam Institute for Economic and Policy Research in Hanoi in Vietnam, and has published extensively on political science in Southeast Asia. He has a PhD in political science from New Zealand, from Victoria University, and has had affiliated positions in the University of Oregon and also the Vietnam Center for Economic and Strategic Studies. So would you please welcome our three speakers tonight?
Thank you very much. And, we always consider Vietnam as a, oasis of stability in Southeast Asia. But in the past few years, we have seen a lot of dramatic changes in Vietnamese politics. Two presidents stepped down, general secretary passed away, and a lot of senior officers were dragged into anti-corruption investigations. And this year brought, I think, one of the most significant political transitions in Vietnamese history, and which set a lot of motion for Vietnam, where Vietnam is heading, and also what implications it might bring for other countries in the region, including Australia as well, because Vietnam, I think, is emerging as one of the very consequential bit of power in the region. So my talk today will structure around two key themes. The first one is about the overall structure of Vietnamese politics, how the latest political transition in Vietnam with the consolidation of Tô Lâm, a career policeman, became the president, then became the party chief, and became again the president earlier this year. How all of those changes affect the overall structure of Vietnamese politics. And secondly, I will talk about the how political dynamics under the new political system in Vietnam might bring to the dynamics into Vietnamese politics, and as well as the implications for its economic and foreign policy as well. So let me just start with the very interesting comparison between Vietnam and China. So normally, people consider Vietnam and China both are communists, with very deep Asian value, kind of like culture. But people normally consider Vietnam and China kind of like sharing the same bed, but with different dreams. In the Chinese system, normally you have kind of like nuclear system with President Xi Jinping at the very center of the system. And collective, deliberation normally reduced to formality only. In Vietnam, we have the system of collective leadership, genuine collective leadership with the four pillars. The general secretary of the Communist Party, the president, the prime minister, and the national chair, the National Assembly chair. Normally, those people working together kept like as checks and balance within the system. But after the recent party congress earlier this year in January, the structure of Vietnam, the four pillars, moves a little bit to kind of like closer to the nuclear model system of China. So now we have Tô Lâm, the career police chief. Now he was elected as general secretary of the Communist Party in January, and last April, that's a month ago, he was also elected as a president, merging two positions at the top four positions of Vietnamese political hierarchy. And it's the first time in Vietnamese history that something like this happened. So that brings Vietnam closer to China and Laos and Cuba in a way that now we don't really have this kind of like collective leadership system like we had before. But at the same time, the Communist Party also promoted the permanent member of the secretariat, basically a vice general secretary, to become another four pillars. But that really doesn't really change the dynamics inside the system. Now we have Tô Lâm as a primary leader. The good thing about that is that actually, even though we have a quite turmoil at the very top of the political echelon of Vietnamese politics, we still see institutional continuity with the elite structure remain quite it's the same basically. So in Vietnam, the two most important political institutions is the Central Committee, basically a parliament of some sort, comprising of 200 members, and the Politburo, kind of like a cabinet for the Communist Party. And those structures, despite all of those changes in the past few years, don't change, at least in terms of of the number. And even though Tolom is a career policeman, so we normally expected we will have more police in the new elite of Vietnam. But if you look at the number, it doesn't really change much in terms of number. So the most number that the police and the military had basically about like 40 years ago, and the number after the market reforms actually gradually, slow down to a very low number for now. But obviously, things change a little bit because many of the police and military officers now they have like more powerful positions and more important positions in civilian posts. So that is something like they have like maybe the same seats but more powerful positions. In terms of demographics, I think it's very interesting as well because we have the median age of the Central Committee is 54, relatively young, for Vietnamese politics career. And they normally, all of those people, they have around like 10 or 15 years ahead of them in their career path, which means that for this term, they would have to work really hard in terms of delivery and in terms of performance so they can impress Tolom and the leadership so that they can be eligible for re-election in the next 5 years. The female Central Committee members, we have the highest ever in the history of the Communist Party, still only 11%, so it's not really as high as we wanted, but it's a positive signal. So for the next 5 years, I think it's very interesting to see we have a young and very kind of like implementation-oriented cohort, which means that Vietnam, I think, will move forward to kind of like more on developmental path, emphasizing mostly more on economic performance instead of ideological alignment like the previous leaders of the Communist Party wanted. Now I turn to the power dynamics of the system. So obviously we have now Tolom as a single most important leader in the Vietnamese system, but he's not quite yet a Xi Jinping, personality in Vietnam. If we compare his power assets, the dual position, the unprecedented position in Vietnamese politics. The second, he controls the coercive apparatus because he's a career policeman. He spent a lot of time in MPS, and he had a lot of his aides still working in MPS, including the Minister of Public Security. And he also expanded the client network from his hometown and MPS to different positions in that system. And in so doing, he kind of like first the position power, the network power, and the narrative power with his reform mandates. What he called Vietnam, entering the era of national rise. But on the counterweights, we also have a few quite powerful factions in Vietnam as well. We have the technocrats, right? The post-war generations, including the prime minister. Most of those younger, senior officers, they came of age after the Vietnam War, so they didn't really experience the Vietnam War, and they have a lot of exposure to international audience. They were trained in the Japan, like the prime minister, or in US, and they are more kind of like tend to bring Vietnam closer to the Western side of the equation than the previous leadership. And then we have regional factions still regain power. Military remain quite strong position within the Central Committee. They occupy around like 25-27% of the Central Committee, so still very powerful. And so for all of that, I think even though Tolom is the most important power, point in Vietnam, but we still have kind of like this power dynamic where we still see there are a lot of counterweights and diversity within the Vietnam elite system, which I think set Vietnam a little bit different from the Chinese system. And so that's to conclude. First, in terms of the collective leadership system in Vietnam, I think the formal structure remain the same, basically, with the Central Committee and the Politburo. But then we have the fundamental change is the merging between the General Secretary position and the presidency into one person. The expansion of the patron-client networks from Tolom, replacing the institutional parts, because now the best way for you to rise through the system is not going through different step by steps, but by trying to get closer to the power center. And then the provincial restructuring process, reducing a lot of local power bases, because previously we have 63 provinces, and after 6 months we have 34. So like half the provinces were gone, and with that, the power of the province also gone as well. So the net result we're going to have is a thinner collective leadership. We still have got roles in the central committee and in the Politburo, but it's very hard. It's much challenging to activate, and probably riskier for the people who want to challenge the power center. And so we're going to have more personalized policy directions with a lot of big implications for domestic and foreign policy. For domestic, if you go to Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh right now, we see a boom of infrastructure projects worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And with that money, people, Vietnam like borrow from overseas and borrow from the private sector with a lot of risk if things go wrong, right? And they still want to emphasize on the double-digit growth from this year until 2030, which is also a very big risk as well, obviously, with all of the geopolitical uncertainty right now. On foreign policy, obviously, it's good to have one leader with more clearer path, in this geopolitical uncertainty. But at the same time, it might become a risk because, personal preference might trump institutional points of contact, and which make it riskier and harder for countries like Australia to interact with countries like Vietnam. And because time is up, so I'll leave it here, and we're gonna discuss more in the discussion. Thank you.